So welcome to today's Tech Hour. It's Thursday, the 6th of April, Thursday, 6th of April, and our topic is the accessibility research work that the arXiv.org has done. They've published a paper on the arXiv in PDF and on their website in HTML. And there's the first accessibility forum this month on the Monday the 17th. So it's a very important event, not just for accessibility, but also for the tech community. And today's Tech Hour and last week's Tech Hour and next week's Tech Hour all devoted in various ways to the accessibility forum, because I think it's a really important thing for the tech community. And I think the involvement of the tech community is also really important for achieving accessibility. So I'll give you a bit of an outline of what I'm going to talk about. So the first page of my notes is a gallop through history. And I think that's really important because the arXiv is trying in some sense to either change the course of history or align itself with the course of history. Now, history is, of course, history of change, and people don't like change and people do like change, and there's a lot going on. So the first thing is 500 years of print, if you like. The second thing is a survey of the accessibility report so that you can have a bit of a bluffer's guide around it or be inspired to read it. So it's got 5 sections, and I'll deal with those 5 sections. And in one of the sections, there are 5 themes that come out that are really important. So I'll put those in at the end, and they can perhaps form the basis of a discussion. People are welcome to pitch in and contribute. If you're shy, then raise a physical or electronic hand, and I'll give way to you. So in a nutshell, the arXiv has about 2 million STEM research articles on it. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, computer science, well, not medicine, but a lot of physics, a lot of computer science, a certain amount of economics, I think. So it has 2 million articles, most of which are written in LaTeX, and most of which don't do very well for accessibility, particularly for the people with visual impairments or blind. And the arXiv is proposing to change their pipeline so that, as well as tech producing PDF, they will also be generating accessible HTML. And when I say HTML in the rest of this conversation, I will mean accessible HTML, not just something that passes the spec, whatever it is. So I've been around for a long time, and I see the present document we're talking about, I consider that to be the 2022/23 accessibility report. It's prepared and published at the end of 22, and it will influence decisions made in 23. And I'm expecting there to be another accessibility report covering 23/24 all the way up to 27/28, which is 5 years from now. So my units of time are 1 year, 5 years, 25 years, and 100 years. And it's quite important to be familiar, if you like, with the significance of all these units. So from 1500 to, sorry, I'm going to let somebody in. From 1500 to 1900, print provided access to STEM research. And in fact, print underlies the modern concept of what science is. For a long time, science, as we call it, physics, was called natural philosophy, the philosophy of the natural world. And what we might call science was the thinkings and writings of Aristotle. And things such as the experimental method and reproducibility all arose in partnership, if you like, with print. So before print, transmission of knowledge was oral and written meant handwritten. Even in the 19th century, legal documents, by which I mean pleadings for a case, were hand copied. So print made a big difference. Something that impressed me was that before Tycho Brahe, you had to go to a particular library to read a particular book, and it would be a particular copy of a particular book. So Tycho Brahe was 1500 to 1600 approximately. And as part of his astronomical enterprise, which by the way didn't use telescopes or the observations with the naked eye, part of his astronomical enterprise included the establishment of a printing press and a paper mill. These things were not commonplace, and as part of disseminating his astronomical research, which was very highly regarded, he got funding for a printing press and a paper mill. In the 19th century, Cambridge University Press was on a block that ended at the river, which was actually very useful for printing machinery and paper coming in and books going out. And this is in the 19th century. So the physicality of print has been important for a long time. So we can think of PDF as being an obstacle to accessibility. But if we go back to the time of Newton, print provided access to scientific research in a way that was previously impossible through dissemination of information. And this continues, there's a residue of that in that we talk about lecture, there are books that are called lectures on such and such, Feynman's lectures on physics, and some of the physics journals are called letters because people wrote to each other and then the letters were published. There's that sort of historicity, but print is providing access to things. So prior to Tycho Brahe was Aldus Manutius, whose dates are 1450 to 1515. He was a printer in Venice, and in some sense, he pioneered the modern paperback and the sort of Penguin Classics and that sort of thing. And he produced what might be called a standard printed edition of the works of Dante and disseminated the classics. And part of that work relied upon and developed a literate class, a class in which literacy was important. So if we go to the 19th century, certainly in Britain, organizations called mechanics institutes were set up in industrial towns for the education of what might be called industrial workers, particularly those who are involved in engineering and manufacturing. And they, of course, relied on printed books. So from the beginning of print in 1400s, 1500s, through to the 19th century, a literate class arose, newspapers arose, rotary printing presses that could print in large numbers arose, and the railways, at least in Britain, allowed information to be transmitted by moving physical pieces of paper overnight, which was a complete revolution. You could, through telegraphic means and newspapers and so forth, you could open a copy of the Times and find out what was happening on the continent yesterday. That was absolutely extraordinary for the time. So if we go to what's happening now, so 2020 to 25 is approximately the era of the mobile phone and the portable devices and the ubiquitous networks. And it is now commonplace that something can happen in New York on one day, and we can see it 30 seconds later live on our screen, even though we're not physically connected to anything except the Ethernet, or except the wireless network, the luminiferous ether, if you like. So the whole raison d'etre of print, which was the communication of information and the replication of information, has gone. We can see video of what's happening as it's happening, which is something that print never could provide, and it's getting fairly ubiquitous. Everywhere you go, you see people looking at their mobile phone, seeing what's going on in the world. So let me step through things quite quickly. I'm doing this to provide a context for what's happening in the archive, because what's happening in the archive now will be instrumental for the next 25 years of communication of scientific research. In other words, it'll take us up to approximately 2050, using my powers of 5. So I mentioned Tycho Brahe, 1500 to 1600. He was followed by Kepler. Kepler discovered that Brahe's observations could be expressed using Kepler's laws. And then, of course, Isaac Newton said, well, there's this theory I've developed called the universal theory of gravitation. And it has as a consequence Kepler's laws. And this planetary motion is really quite extraordinary. And I think you have to accept, in so many words, that there's a uniform in infinite space and time, and the sun is the center of our solar system, and we're not the center of our solar system, which is a bit of a blow, but there we are. So there's Isaac Newton. I think it's worth mentioning for the 18th century, 1700 to 1800, John Harrison, who developed the chronometer, which is actually a really, really important research tool, because it can say, this is where you are on the surface of the globe. I saw an interesting looking fish. Where did you see it? Oh, I don't know. It was a Thursday, but I don't know where I was. And similarly, the British did large numbers of oceanographic measurements, and they could say, there's this island that we haven't seen before, and this is exactly where it is. So that sort of reproducible research was enabled by the chronometer. And the chronometer, if you like, was enabled by a scientific spirit. And print allowed the production of maps. So you see everything sort of working swimmingly. And it goes that way all the way up to about 1900. 1900, I think, was about the pinnacle of print. You had rotary presses driven by steam that could produce thousands of copies. You had newspapers where you had 1 million copies printed. You had overnight distribution by trains, at least in this country. And you also had the International Postal Union, the UPI, which allowed you to put postage on in one country and it would arrive to another country without additional postage being provided. which was quite an achievement at the time, and it took a lot of work. Previously, if you wanted to send a letter from the United States to Bordeaux, you'd have to put stamps on it to get it to France, and then you have to put French stamps on it to get it to Bordeaux, whereas the UPI abolished all that nonsense. So 1900 was about the pinnacle of print, and that's really important to remember when we think about what the arXiv is up to now, because print has passed its pinnacle. However, it has 400 or 500 years of history, so it has an enormous amount of momentum and status. And then in the 20th century, we had telephone, radio, cinema, television, computing, aeroplanes as well. And towards the end of the 20th century, we were having specialist networks, by which I mean you had to be somebody special to send or receive email. And do you remember, towards the end of the 20th century, at least in Britain, you could pay money and then you could get an internet connection over your phone line through a modem. So the telephone system is being used as a carrier for the internet system, whereas now a lot of it takes place the other way around, that the internet system is the carrier for the telephone. So there's big changes taking place. And from about 2000 onwards, we have the growth of the mobile devices and also the whole issue of accessibility coming in. So that's the sort of background that I find quite helpful for understanding habits and thinking in a comfortable and creative way about things. I'm going to pause in case anybody wants to pitch in. I'm very welcome to have any comments. Nobody. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is give a summary of the arXiv paper. Barriers to access. I mean, let me say that in the 20th century, the solution to barriers to access for the first half was Braille. Make the material available in Braille. That mitigates the barrier to access. In the second half of the 20th century, you're starting to have what might be called audiobooks and the growth of things like tape recorders. And that again reduces barrier to access. But at the beginning of the present century, you're having documents being produced for print, but they're electronic documents. And at that point, barrier to access is, there is this electronic document that has the information we need. Can't we re-render it so that it's accessible for people who can't read print? It's an entirely new problem because the production of print has gone digital. That's the thing that has given the opportunity and the expectation that research publications in the normal course of events will be accessible to users who are visually disabled. So the Access report, the arXiv report, talks about the widely recognized social and economic cost of a lack of accessibility. It diminishes society, it diminishes self-esteem, it diminishes wealth. And part of the social cost is that life prospects are much better if you can find work. That's part of the social cost. The second section is mandates. There are legal mandates requiring accessibility, and there are social mandates from the research community. So later on in the report says, our community, the community of the people that use the arXiv, have got goals and wishes regarding accessibility. That provides a mandate. And the report identifies means of meeting that mandate, as well as the importance of meeting that mandate. So the third part of the report is the current state of affairs. And I'm going to cherry pick a bit here. The first is PDF can only catch up with HTML. Any accessibility that PDF can provide in the future, HTML can already provide. So HTML is a preferred medium in many ways. That's not directly stated by the report, but it's a quote from Jonathan Godfrey that's very strongly highlighted. The next thing is from the report, no existing tools provide smooth experience from author to reader. There is a deficiency in tools. So work has to be done in improving tools and creating new tools. There aren't the tools that do the job for us yet. And the third thing is that the arXiv intends to close this gap so that authors can communicate accessibly to readers. And also, I think it's part of their goal that the authors with visual disabilities can author. But the report says, we believe closing this gap is achievable today, although still not easy. I think today is a little bit exaggerated. I'd be happy with this year. What can we do this year is a good topic, and I'm quite interested in knowing what should be in the Access report for next year. What sort of topics should we be having in the Access report next year? So the fourth thing is researching accessibility, and they've done a quantitative survey and qualitative interviews. The interviews are talking to people. I was one of the people interviewed because they think I know something about tech and LaTeX. And this is the real body of the report, and it provides sufficient information to keep us going at least for a year or two. So it provides enough information for us to make high-level decisions for this year. What are the high-level decisions? Focus on HTML, and also things such as the tools and processes, that sort of thing. So I've got a question here, which is, what are the research tasks needed in order to make good decisions in 2024? What decisions will we be making in 2024? And what research do we need to do this year to make those decisions? So Tech Live runs on a yearly cycle. And if we're going to make decisions in 2024 as to what adaptions, alterations, and so forth might be required for Tech Live, we need research of some sort to support those decisions this year. So this year, if you want to see a better Tech Live in 2024, you'll have to do some persuasive research, I suggest, this year. So the fifth section is the arXiv plans. The first thing is that I'll say it again, for them, for the arXiv, HTML means well-formatted, semantic HTML with the necessary ARIA tags. ARIA is tagging that allows you to interact with the screen reader, and there is some need for a sort of appendix or beginner's guide that explains all the terms that are used in the arXiv accessibility report. I think that would be a great help to allow communication and bring people into the area. Now, 90% of the arXiv submissions are tech, and they're mainly LaTeX. And the report says that there need to be substantial changes to the arXiv pipeline behind the scenes. So I think that knowing something about why those changes are needed and what they need to be is something that needs to take place this year if we're going to have a good chance of putting such changes into production next year. And the conclusion, which I've foreshadowed, our community, the community of arXiv users, want the arXiv to provide accessible HTML alongside existing sources and outputs. So this is massive for the tech community, because the tech community see themselves as standing in the tradition of Gutenberg. Whereas HTML, I'm not sure what they see themselves. They probably see themselves standing in the tradition of Tim Berners-Lee and the electronic access to information. I'm going to finish my monologue with 5 themes that were identified from the interviews. The first is that the users of the arXiv that use assistive technology identify PDF as being their biggest obstacle. If they use screen readers, then the fact that their screen readers fall over, I'm exaggerating perhaps, but I'm not using the right words, but the difficulty their screen readers have with PDF is their biggest obstacle. So they've already managed to get on top of assistive technology, but the assistive technology hasn't managed to get on top of the PDF. So that's the first thing. And it may be tagged PDF when it arrives will considerably ameliorate that situation. But that's where we are. The second thing is that HTML mitigates accessibility issues for many disabilities and for most users. So HTML is giving a lot of benefit all over the place. The third thing is that there's deep skepticism, even despair, about real change. And I haven't dug very deeply in that, but if that's correct, then morale is important and well-chosen projects are important. By which I mean not a big project that will produce results in 5 years' time, but something that has an immediate effect. In fact, that's the fourth thing, which is from the interviews, they have identified that the arXiv can have a powerful and immediate impact. And I think that's because so many people see it and interact with it. So if I read an article on the arXiv and I find, oh, not only is it available in PDF, but it's also available in HTML. And perhaps the HTML version has got advantages, such as I can give a link to a particular theorem. That will influence me. I'll become aware of it because I'm becoming aware of it at the point at which I'm using it. Whereas a lot of researchers are quite busy and they don't hunt the new technology that has to be made available to them. So the arXiv can have a powerful and immediate impact. I think it would be really great if we could do something to make sure that the HTML abstracts in the arXiv are even better than they presently are. Looking at the quality of the abstracts will aid with the discovery, which is one of the issues. The fifth thing is that HTML is a first step to giving disabled readers the access they wish for, that gives them the same capabilities as sighted readers. So the picture, the example I picked up on that is skipping information. Can I navigate quickly to the parts of the paper that interest me? Can I read the first 2 words or 3 words of a paragraph and say, no, this isn't what I want, give me the next paragraph? Can I search for a paragraph that contains a particular phrase or concept? You see, all of these things are quite easy for sighted readers without special tools, because you can, so to speak, take a whole page in at a glance, whereas if you're blind, it's not so easy. So there's the end of it. Nelson.
Yeah, I'll make one comment here. On Thursday, the 13th of July in the afternoon in Bonn, Germany, the day before the TUG meeting, there is a session on tag PDF organized by the LaTeX team. It says seating is limited, so that may be of interest for some people. I have other commitments, so I won't get there till that evening. But I will certainly read what they produce, and I know it's been an issue that is discussed to some extent in the new edition of the LaTeX Companion, which I heard yesterday from Boris's letter to everybody that may be available by about May, so next month sometime. And I think that that's a start. Getting the as much of the content at arXiv.org out in HTML form, given that 60 to 70% is now more or less been converted. Now we may still be missing adequate markup for visually handicapped readers is important. But as Kevin noted in one of the last couple of weeks, that publishers tend to want to provide PDF content, but they don't want to provide the input content that has the structure in it, whether that's LaTeX or XML. I think that's a problem we're going to have to face with publishers, that unless they see that they can make money from this, they're going to be disinclined to do it. Now, I've noticed that some publishers now, when you visit a DOI to get to an article, it immediately comes up in HTML form, or perhaps the leading part of the article, and then you have a choice of continuing to read it in HTML, or you can get a PDF. So some publishers, I think, are perhaps recognizing that, but I have not ever attempted to use any kind of an audio reader with that HTML to see if it makes any sense.
The issue of tag PDF is a difficult and interesting one.
Now, there's one thing we might be able to do, and that is away from the commercial publishers, which dominate the scientific journal production market. We have the professional societies, American Mathematical, Chemical, Physical, Biological societies, equivalent ones in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, SIAM, and so on. Perhaps we might have better influence within these organizations, because if enough independent publishers started addressing the accessibility issue by providing adequately marked up HTML, that might really force the commercial publishers to follow suit. Just that because the commercial ones really feel they have to make money from everything they do, I don't think they see a lot of incentive to address accessibility.
I'm not sure I agree with that assessment of the relative merits of, from an accessibility point of view, of visually impaired accessibility point of view, between commercial and learned society publishers. The commercial publishers, of course, tend to fall down quite strongly in terms of paywalls. The learned societies tend to be much more open access. But without having evidence, my experience is that Well, for example, I've come across articles which I've wanted to read from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and I find that they produce pretty good HTML from my non-expert point of view. What would be quite helpful, I think, would be to have metrics as to how good things are. The quantitative survey that the arXiv has done is a start, and one would like to see year on year progress being made in terms of the metrics, and we'd like the metrics to be improved. And at some point, the metrics should be sufficient to say, well, this particular article that you have just submitted is pretty good regarding accessibility. Well done. So those sorts of things can be developed over time, I think.
Yeah, and we can recall that Kelly Johnson, who's appeared in this office hour multiple times over the last couple of years, has observed that she has a lot of encouragement / pressure in her field of fisheries research to provide accessible documents. And that's one of the reasons why she went the route of R Markdown as a route to HTML for technical documentation. So what I'm getting to here is that it could be that government pressure on the commercial market could move it more in the direction of improving accessibility.
Yeah, there's a reasonable point of view that says that accessibility is not a technical issue. It's a question of civil rights. And certainly if there are not access ramps, or somebody's on a train and they can't use a toilet because there's no accessible toilet that works, or people are stuck on a plane because there's nobody there to provide the wheelchair that takes them off, all those sorts of things are in many ways civil rights matters. And my understanding is that after the Vietnam War, there are a substantial number of Vietnam veterans who had disabilities, and they were organized and articulate. And one of the consequences was the sidewalks had little cutouts for them, so a wheelchair could go into the road and cross the road without being a great big lump on the pavement.
Yeah,
you want to say something?
That's happening in my city. They're gradually going around to intersections in both downtown as well as residential streets and putting in those bumpy things at the intersections that allow a wheelchair to move slowly. Also, the United States has the Americans with Disabilities Act, which mandates or encourages physical accessibility to, for example, buildings. I don't know to what extent it affects accessibility to publications. Perhaps others in this group know. And I don't know to what extent other countries in Europe, for example, is there a European-wide equivalent of the Disabilities Act in America?
Britain is divided from Europe by the English Channel, as we call it.
Well, but until recently it wasn't, so you can still speak for the EU.
I don't have any special knowledge, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
That is something that is important, which is that there's a sort of localism to this as well, that each country has its own traditions. I've seen this quite strongly in my readings on the blind math list, where each country sort of produces its own adaptations and uniformity regarding Braille. A bit like the code pages that IBM introduced for foreign languages on their keyboard.
Carver here. Sorry, I've listened to everything, but I was on a bus, so I couldn't talk. But as always, really interesting. So on the accessibility in Britain, definitely there are laws, and I was talking to a couple of publishers recently. I've been mentioning the arXiv forum coming up, And even before I mentioned it, they said, well, of course, accessibility is really important. There is something coming in 2025, apparently. I don't know quite what it is, but there's a specific thing coming in. So there is a race for accessibility for publishers. So definitely that may be part of the reason for the great interest in the arXiv forum. And sorry, if I can just on another point, is there any the portion, say the 60% that has already been made into HTML with R5? Has there been any measure of the accessibility of those to visually impaired readers, for example?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, we're basically in the progress of integrating that into the main arXiv system. And I mean, Chris could talk more on it, but
yeah, I'm not sure if I should. I haven't cleared anything with Charles, so. But yeah, that is an important consideration and one that we're aware of. And Shamsi has been working to collect a list of people who will be willing to give us good in-depth feedback on interfaces and formats, and just generally educate us in what it's like to be a person with low vision trying to consume and produce science. So we've identified people to talk to, and it's on our radar.
Thank you. Great.
Something that has struck me that arises from what Christopher just said is that, how can I put him? Okay, so Aldous Manutius needed a community of readers, and he developed a community of readers, but he didn't he didn't run libraries, for example. So in all of these sort of social changes, you need infrastructure growing in all sorts of ways. One of the most striking examples of this, that with the rise of railways, there was an increased demand for a horse and cart. It may sound bizarre, but the rise of railways meant that more freight was carried. There was more goods being moved. And when the goods arrived at their destination railway station, they then had to be taken to their final customer or collected by the final customer, hence the need for horses and carts. So the arXiv will benefit from all sorts of things, including, as Chris said, expert information about what makes things accessible and not accessible. And in a certain sense, that is a responsibility of the whole community and not just a responsibility of the arXiv. Just as the arXiv will require adjustments and refinements, let's say, to the TechLive distribution. And that's not the responsibility of the arXiv, but they do have a responsibility to say to TechLive and also to MikTech, these are the things that we would like to have you enable. So there is this thing, I think it's quite delicate, of well, in manufacturing terms, it's sort of vertical integration and horizontal integration, I think it's called. But the question of what to do when the infrastructure isn't there. We're missing important parts of infrastructure. One of the things that I particularly feel I'm missing, which I'm trying to solve myself, is the ability to run a document from 15 years ago, exactly the same as it was run when it went on the arXiv. That's an infrastructure question that's very important for me. And coordinating all of that and getting that ecosystem around it is really something quite interesting. And it's part of, if you like, the broad social problem of society of which we're part, organizing itself to solve a social problem. And of course, the early days of tech, you had things like tape distributions and Nelson's heroic, or whatever you want to call it, work, heroic will do, to write printer drivers, which it's, I would say, important pedestrian work. I hope that's not mis-selling it.
No, that was clearly a problem in roughly 1980, as it became clear that more and more people would have access to tech, but most of them would be completely unable to either preview it or print it. And so we had to get drivers working for many different printing devices in the hope that we could solve that problem. And once laser printers, and in particular PostScript, appeared, which is roughly the mid-1980s, the need to support output on, say, a dot matrix printer dropped fairly dramatically once the prices fell, because in 1985, a laser printer was a $20,000 device in the United States. But by 1990, the prices had dropped to the order of $5,000. And now, of course, you can get one for $200.
Yeah, it would be helpful to have a sort of wish list from the archive along the lines of, it would be nice if somebody solved this problem, and this is how it would help us. This is why we want, not just this is what we want, but this is why it's a problem for us. That would be quite helpful.
Could I ask a question of David and Christopher? You may be familiar with statistics of downloads from the archive, where you can get both the input documents as well as the PDF documents or HTML equivalents. Do many people actually retrieve the original documents? I mean, I must confess that I've only ever pulled down PDF because I was just interested in the publication view, not in how the author actually formatted the input.
I mean, I believe most users download the PDF. I think there's other services like R5 that download the source and compile it. It's probably, a few services do that.
The archive prevents you getting these things from using wget. You can't wget the document sources because they're protecting their bandwidth.
Yes, you generate alerts in the dev channel, and then someone will block you.
You wake me up in the middle of the night when I have. It's handled automatically for the most part, but you have to be hitting us at a very high rate to end up triggering some of our.
Oh, I tried it once and got nothing, and I don't know why.
You should be able to download a certain amount. I'm not going to check numbers, but
okay. I mean, I did discover by chance that you have Amazon buckets, if that's the right word, containing all the archive stuff, and anybody can download those if they want to, but it's on a download a pays basis. You have to have an Amazon account, and the cost of the download comes from your Amazon account, which I think is fair and reasonable.
Right, but we also have, we're part of Kaggle. We have, like, the data set is in Kaggle. You can just get it from them, and I don't believe they charge for that.
Okay. It would be nice to have a regular place where people meet in relationship to the archive project. So the forum is an annual event. I hope we'll have one next year.
Well, Shams is working on like a discussion group that would carry on beyond the actual forum this month. So we're hoping that the discussion will continue on until the next forum seminar, whenever that happens.
what I find really most significant and important is the social side of it, by which I don't mean sitting on beaches with waves coming in or anything else like that, but that the community side of it, and the idea that together we can make things better. And the more of that we have, the better. And I'm really encouraged by that taking place. And I'm sure that there's an enormous amount of goodwill and enthusiasm amongst the users of the arXiv. Even if it's only 10% or 5% of the users of the arXiv that have goodwill and enthusiasm for accessibility, that is tens of thousands of people, I'm sure. And once there are clear gains being made, there will be more interest, more momentum, and more people willing to devote time and resources. And that includes both individuals and philanthropic organizations such as the Simons Foundation. And the Simons Foundation publishes math articles that I look at, and they often reference a paper in the arXiv. And it would be great if all the papers referenced in Quantum magazine were available in accessible HTML. That would be a big feather in a lot of people's caps. And the first copy, the first time you do it, it's more expensive. It gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. You know, like the prototype of a CPU is very expensive, but when you've got it all sorted out, they become a lot cheaper. So I've got a lot of optimism, and where I do have concerns, it's along the lines of places where there's a certain amount of darkness, let's just put it that way. So we don't know how to do things, we don't have skills in this area, or the people who do have skills in this area are not interested. The Tech Live team, for example, is probably resistant to change. In fact, they are resistant to change. And one of the things that's likely to make a big difference is if tech could run in a browser. If you didn't have to install anything to run tech, because you run it in the browser by using WebAssembly, that would be a really big change. And it would make it a lot easier to get the tools needed for accessibility into the hands of authors. So it's that sort of large change which forms a blockage, just as according to the arXiv's accessibility report, a lot of people are finding PDF as being the blockage. The fact that the stuff is available only in PDF blocks a lot of the people who use assistive technology. So the fact that tech is available only in the form of Tech Live and MicTech, or on MacTech, and not available in the browser, is a sort of block of sorts. So dealing with those blockages is one of the things that these things will appear, I think, based upon my miserable experience.
Yeah, there's only so much we can do at arXiv. I think we're depending on the community for a lot of help. And
That's right.
I mean, what once we are able to present the HTML, then there's the issue of refining it and making it better. And so there's this issue of how much work are authors and other people willing to add to help do this. And I'm hoping it'll be sort of a community-wide effort to help out.
I think empowerment is quite if we can empower the people who are affected, that's going to make a big difference. And that's both technical empowerment and, if you like, psychological empowerment, that they shouldn't feel embarrassed of asking. I quite like the civil rights view of accessibility. I think there's a lot going for that.
I've written down your suggestion about a wish list for arXiv.
A wish list, right? That would be lovely.
Yeah, I've written down that suggestion to take back to the team. I think that would be that could be really helpful, and it's good for us to produce such a thing, even if we never share it. It's a good exercise on its own. But yes, it'd be nice to share it too. So I'll take that back to the team. Thank you.
Yeah. I could interject a comment here. Part of the work that the LaTeX team has been doing over the last rather many years now is rewriting the original core of LaTeX in a more maintainable and more easily understandable form. And one of the good things they've done with that effort, besides maintaining an almost bit-for-bit compatibility with the old formats, is that the last couple of years, perhaps maybe 3 or 4 now, if you add -dev to the executable name, like LaTeX-dev, you're using LaTeX 3 instead of 2.epsilon. And one of the features of LaTeX 3 is that most environments have hooks. And one of the things this means is that ordinary users can, with very simple commands, attach things to be either typeset or recorded in the output file at the point of the appearance of objects like chapters, sections, tables, figures, and so on. And I think it would be relatively straightforward then to for example, in DVI, to introduce specials or whatever equivalent there is in PDF, and say this is the start of the chapter heading and this is the end of the chapter heading, because that would then give fodder in those output files that could recover the structure without any changes being needed at all in the user manual scripts, which is where the big hurdle is, because we've got lots and lots of authors and they don't want to learn new stuff.
Nelson and I hesitate to say, but I'll say it anyway, agree on something and disagree on something. I think we agree that further work is required with LaTeX to produce an acceptable solution in terms of the PDF it produces for accessibility. So we agreed that further work is required on LaTeX is required for LaTeX to produce accessible results. My view is that it's easier to start from scratch or work around the problem and leave LaTeX as it is. Whereas Nelson and Frank Mittelbach's view is that LaTeX should be developed so that these problems can be resolved.
Yeah,
I'm glad that, Nelson, over to you.
Yeah, for someone who's new to document publishing in science, they may well be prepared to adopt a new system and proceed with it. Those of us who are older have been concerned about the longevity of documents. See, for people used to reading newspapers, you know that you read the paper today and you wrap fish in it tomorrow, or your kitchen waste. But for scientists, it's really, really important that their documents still be accessible, not accessible for handicapped people, but namely ability to be able to be reused for new additions and updates and so on, essentially over the length of their careers and perhaps much longer than that. And that's not something we ever had the possibility of doing until tech came along, because either we just had mechanical typewriters that were producing the input manuscripts, which was the case when I was in graduate school, or we had commercial systems like Microsoft Word and WordPerfect and so on that had no interest whatsoever in longevity and preservation of input to output streams. And often also were licensed, and when the license expired, you could no longer format your document. So tech was really an eye-opener, because tech and TROF together made it possible to think of long-term stability of documents where you could modify the input and produce the output again. I happen to be on the Unix Heritage Society mailing list, and one of the things that's been reported in the last several weeks is ongoing work to reconstruct the TROF input that produced the documentation files that were available only in printed books or manuals. And there's been some fairly good success in that, because sadly, what happened with a lot of early Unix is a lot of computing files was that they were largely lost. So we have a printed book that has, say, the manual pages from a certain version of Unix, but we don't have the input files that can produce that. But I think it's encouraging that people have been willing to put in the effort to try to reconstruct a reproducible system from which you could do things like develop version control histories to see how did things change between a certain version of the operating system to the next one, which is much harder to do when all you have is the displayed typeset output. So I think these are good things, and I don't have, at this stage in my life, have a strong interest to learn a new input system for my documents. But that's just me and a reflection of the time I have left for being productive. And I have a lot of software support as well for what I do in the form of various software tools that deal with tech files and editing, fantastic editing support and enhanced Emacs and so on, that are just absent in these other systems.
I'd be very pleased, and I'm sure Nelson would be too, if we had software that could validate LaTeX input files and say, look, there's an error in this input file, and if you run it with tech, you'll get a tech error. But instead of getting the tech error and not knowing what's caused it, you're told what your error is. So at the very least, mismatched anything mismatched should be immediately reported even before it gets to tech. And a tool like, if a tool can understand LaTeX source that well, then it can probably go a long way to making the source readable so that you can produce a document object model, and then you've got some chance of generating a faithful XML representation of it, and wouldn't we be happy with that? So the familiarity the authors have with LaTeX is something that should not be disturbed without good reason. And Nelson and I agree on that, I think. Yeah, it's similar to most programming language. Python is one of the big exceptions. Use curly braces for grouping, because people learned that with C, and so everybody else does it, except Python. Over to you, Nelson, if you want.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that back in the 90s, I published tugboat articles on rigorous grammars for BibTeX, and then developed a suite of tools that support the use of those grammars. And so in my routine bibliographic work, which now is run to millions of entries, which have been seen many times by my own eyes, before I even typeset the wrapper script that ensures that the entire bibliographic file can be typeset successfully, I run a parse on it and a delimiter check. And those are just 2 quick button clicks in an Emacs session that take a tiny fraction of a second to run. And if they report errors, I can immediately fix them. If they don't, then I'm willing to spend the tens of seconds that it takes to typeset the document and install it on the web. And unfortunately, because LaTeX and Tech were really never strongly based on grammars, although they ought to have been in retrospect, we really don't have that ability. In HTML, most HTML doesn't conform to the grammar either, even though there have been for 25 plus years now freely available tools that check for adherence to the grammar. The problem is that with HTML, people never even bothered to identify which version of HTML they were using. The browsers had to sort of intuit by looking at the markup to figure out, well, was this HTML 1.0, 1.1, 2.0, and so on. And the browsers have done a pretty good job, I think. And so most people don't notice the absence of the grammar. But if the files were grammatically correct, you could do much more automated processing on HTML files. It's very difficult to do at present.
I think for Christopher, a suggestion is that you put validation tools on your wish list. And it doesn't have to be any more specific than that. We want validation tools.
That will tell you if it will compile when you submit it and if it will produce nice HTML, and that sort of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The Web Consortium has free online validation tools for HTML pages and also for cascading style sheet style files. And I make a point in all of my web pages of putting a little icon that links to that service so that it's just a quick button click for me when I update a web page to make sure that it's still correct. Because of the forgivingness of browsers, it's easy to forget, say, a closing tag at the end of a font change, and it'll display, but you may not notice it switched from Roman font to typewriter font or something like that. Whereas the grammar checker will catch that immediately.
Any sorts of validation tools can be useful. I've discovered that tech log files sometimes can't be read as UTF-8 files. Because they've got effectively binary characters in them.
Yeah. And they also have enforced line breaks in the middle of words, which has always bothered me.
Yeah. Yeah. So
the days of operating systems that kicked you off the machine because you went past column 80 and an input line are basically gone. And so there's no particular reason to introduce necessarily line wrapping. And yet tech log files do it, and so do email systems.
Basically, a validation tool is anything that makes a noise, anything that makes sounds that isn't a noise, that isn't random noise, you know. I mean, one of the standard Unix tools, I think, is simply check for repeated words, the, that. And that's a validation tool. Are there any repeated words? For what it's worth, the Colossal Codebreaker sort of had a validation tool, which it used a brute force approach to decode the Lorentz cipher. And the way in which it knew that it had decoded the Lorentz cipher was that the distribution of the characters was no longer random. That's a validation tool. So anything that creates a useful noise, you know, if there are obsolete packages or packages that are troublesome, and the validation tool says, oh, this is using such and such a package. If it's useful information, then it's a validation tool. It doesn't have to be all singing, all dancing. If you've got a dozen of those tools, each of which giving a significant piece of information, then you could say, then you can use that to triage your documents. You can say, these ones look good, these ones don't look good, these ones we don't know about. So any validation tools that produce some significant outcome.
I think I read about a third-party validation tool, but I'll see if I can find it. If I find it, I'll drop it in chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for tech and LaTeX, there's check tech and LA check, which are both useful, although they often do produce lots of false positives.
There was something arXiv specific that it would help you prepare your source for arXiv. It would pull out it would identify or remove some kind of known problematic structures, strip out some files that are bad, and like some other prep work. I'm trying to remember what the name of that one was.
Good. Google had a tool that stripped out comments that could contain internal information.
That's a good one.
It's on a Google account on GitHub, I think, somewhere. So any tools relating to checking the quality of the input and the quality of the output could potentially be useful. And in the end, you want a tool that says, this looks pretty good. Or this has got problems here, here, and here.
I'm not recommending these, but I'm dropping them in the chat. I haven't evaluated them myself, and they're not recommended by arXiv, but they are out there.
Whenever I compose email in Gmail, I get these wiggly lines appearing for grammar errors and spelling mistakes. And that's a validation tool. Well, shall we have a closing? Shall we close? Yeah. So I'm looking forward to the conference, the work forum. I suspect there'll be several hundred people there, and I won't be able to greet them all individually. It looks like it's going to be a tremendous opportunity and also a great challenge. I hope it all goes well. Next week, I will be giving a report on my progress with unLaTeX, which in a certain sense, its goal is to produce an access tree from the PDF in the same way that the LaTeX 3 project want to produce an access tree from the PDF. But I'll use an analogy I used elsewhere, which is getting accessible output out of the PDF is a bit like juggling. Putting the tags in as well is a bit like juggling while you're riding a unicycle. So I'm not going to bother putting the tags in. I just want to get the accessibility tree as best as I can out of it. And if I get a decent accessibility tree out of the unLaTeX software that I'm writing, then the LaTeX 3 team are very, very welcome to take that accessibility tree and incorporate it into that PDF. I'd be very pleased if they're willing to do that. But my focus at the moment is just getting the accessibility tree out of the boxes that are shipped out. And unLaTeX is the name of the tool that I'm doing to deal with that. So I'm going to give a report on such progress as I've made next week.
I'm looking forward to it. It's an interesting project.
Well, thank you. I hope I have something interesting to report. Any more closing remarks? Otherwise, nice to see you all, and I hope to see you all again next week. And I'm looking forward to the accessibility forum.
Indeed. Yeah. See you next week.
Bye.